All right, this fly is called a Backflop Jig, and this is going to be new in the Umpqua catalog for 2022. This is a jig that I use for Euro-style nymphing, jig streamer fishing essentially. So you can dead drift it, you can also jig it along, and it fishes really well all year round, but I really fish it a lot during the winter when fish are potted up in pools, and is a really good way to kind of break them out of their doldrums and get them to eat. Okay, so I'm starting with a size 8 jig hook. I have a 3.8 millimeter tungsten bead on here. I sometimes will go down to a 2.8 millimeter bead for really shallow water on this fly, but normally I fish either a 3.3, a 3.8, or a 4.6 millimeter tungsten bead. I'll also use inverting tungsten beads on this fly because I can get more weight for the same size bead. So especially if I need to stay comp legal, then I'll use a 4 millimeter inverting tungsten bead. And then I'll even bury some tungsten beads behind it sometimes if I need some extra under the dressing. But for this one, we're just going to use the 3.8 millimeter and start by adding some lead wire. So I've got some 25 thousandths of an inch thick lead wire, and I put some super glue on the shank, and that's going to hold this in place so I don't have to try and wrap it all down with thread to begin with. You could use 30 thousandths inch thick for this size of a jig as well. Any diameter that you want. It'll just make the body a little bit thicker, but probably not drastically so. And then I'm just using the side of my scissors to make the tips of the wire flush and kind of make them get out of the way so as I wrap thread it doesn't catch and cut my thread. So now I'll start my thread. I have A-dot black uni. You could use 6-dot for this as well, but you don't really need to crank much in the line of materials down for this fly, so A-dot works just fine. And I'm actually going to take that thread slightly onto the bend of that hook. And then next I'm going to tie in the tail, and the body and the tail for this fly is largely made out of pine squirrel. So it's a real simple pattern. It's kind of leechy, kind of sculpin-y, just kind of movement based streamer. And I've wetted the pine squirrel down, so I have a little bowl of water over here, and I've wetted the fibers down a little bit. And this is going to help me manage them, keep them out of the way so that I don't put them on my thread. So I stroke the fibers out of the way so that I've got, at the tie-in point, I've got the fibers divided so that half of them face forward and half of them face back. Or right at the tie-in point, they face forward and back. And then I'm going to do a pinch wrap right there. And I'm going to crank that down a bunch of times. And then I'm also going to do something a little bit unique. And then I'm going to go back and wrap around the base of that strip. Kind of like this is a parachute post. And it might seem a little bit weird, but one of the biggest issues I've had with pine squirrel or rabbit strips in the past is that they tend to foul around the hook a lot. So you'll be sitting there fishing them, catching a lot of fish, and then all of a sudden you'll wonder why it stopped. And then you pull it up. This is especially in lakes, I have this a lot. And I'll pull it up, and all of a sudden I see that the tail is fouled around the hook, and it's very obvious then why the fly stopped working. So one of the things that I've been able to figure out over the last 5 years or so, and I do this with marabou as well, is that if I wrap that tail down onto the bend of the hook just a little bit, and then I kind of do that parachute post motion with the thread around the base of it just to stiffen up the base itself at the hook juncture, then that kind of props it away from the hook and reduces fouling. Okay, so now I'm going to just stroke it back, and I'm going to tie in the other fiber that or the other material we're going to use for the body, and this is medium UV polar chenille in black. And obviously the pine squirrel is black on this. I tie this fly in tan and olive versions as well. And all three of those colors are good to have to see what streamer color the fish want on the day. And this next move, it comes from a pattern called the Schultz minnow that Greg Pearson showed me a few months back or a little while back while we were stillwater fishing. And when I saw it, not only did I immediately realize that it would work for other materials besides just the large rabbit that he was using, but I instantly thought about jig streamers as well. And then I went home that weekend, tied some stillwater versions, kind of like the ones that he'd show me, but I instantly started working on some river versions as well. And this is what came out of it, and it's worked very well on the rivers for me. So I'm going to take these materials and pair them up in my fingers. So out of the frame here, I'm pinching with my thumb and my index finger on my right hand, and I'm just kind of pairing these and stroking the fibers back. And I've made a whip finish up here at the front, and I have my thread on my bobbin cradle here, which is also out of the frame. There you go. On my bobbin cradle, so it's being held, and I'm going to use the rotary function to just wrap this forward, and after every wrap, I'm going to hurry and make just a quick stroke. And because the fibers are still wet, they stroke out of the way. And I'm going to tie this off right here, leaving a bit of space because we're going to put just a couple more materials on. Come in and trim that as flush as I can. And make sure that any of those polar chenille fibers are kind of trapped down and out of the way before the next step. Okay, so then the second to last step here, I'm going to add a black soft tackle. So this is black India hen. You could use any sort of black hen saddle. Grizzly would work fine, probably. Brahma hen, something like that. So I've got black hen or black India hen here. Just tie that in. All right, a couple turns of the hackle here. Tie that off. And it looks a little bit shaggy and jumbled and not very clean as is, which is fine. So I'm going to stroke the fibers back, just do a quick turn over the top, and then add a couple of turns of black UV ice dub here. And that's going to clean the front of the fly up. And make it look a lot better. Okay. And then, like I do on most of my flies, to improve the durability, I'm going to just add a little bit of super glue to this thread, do a couple of turns, and then come in with my whip finisher. 1, 2, 3 wraps, and lock that all in with the super glue. And now that is the finished backflop jig. And it looks a little bit different, you know, being wet at this point, but if you watch this in the water, it's got tons of movement, but it's still a small and compact enough streamer that it sinks fairly well compared to a lot of others, so it works well on a Euro rig. And I definitely would say that if you go out and try this and jig it around or drift it around in your local river, you're going to catch some trout.